Okay, so we're going to move on to the next question, which was assigning the purchase agreement. So you basically have to put an assignment clause. The assignment clause can be worded any way you like. You can put an assignment clause that says, that if you basically look at, there's two different properties where the assignment clause comes up pretty often. The first one would be with a new construction property. I'm sure you heard of new condos being built, and then people like to buy them, but instead of closing them, they'd like to assign it to another buyer at a profit. Now, the builder has to allow to do that. Sometimes the builder has a fee to the buyer, and they say, hey, sure, no problem. You can assign the condo you bought for $300,000 at $400,000 to another buyer, and then the buyer has to pay a fee of $2,500 to the builder to draw up the paperwork again and just redo everything and get it over to the new buyer. Just so you know, if the second buyer defaults, the liability falls right back to the first buyer. So that's a pretty interesting situation to be in, and you want to be aware of that. That the buyer that you're actually putting in place of you should be a really strong buyer.
Okay, I think one of the question on the exam was something to do with you can't assign liabilities or something
That's pretty much what we just talked about. You can't assign liabilities because you're technically in an assignment for a transaction like that. You're still technically liable because since you signed the agreement originally, you're still on the hook. If the second person, let's say the second person's some investor from Hong Kong and they get up and just leave and they never come back.
Okay.
And they say, just hell with it. I don't have the rest of the money. And so now you're back on the hook.
Okay.
And the builder can probably, keep that deposit, and then they default, and then it comes back to you that you've got to go back and resume the transaction.
Okay.
So that's that question. Your next one was clause by clause review, agreement in writing, pre-printed versus inserted. So I guess you were looking at the original agreement, and there's some pre-printed clauses. If you open up a sample agreement, I can go over it with you, or we can do that last if you want to.
Is that just saying pretty much whatever's in Schedule A overrides what is in the pre-printed clauses? If they insert something about a mortgage, but it says
no, the way you really want to structure an agreement, because like I said, you want to be very careful and you want to protect yourself. So let's just say you're doing a transaction, and I'll just say I'm your buyer, and I'd like to buy the property, and you say, okay, cool, I'm going to write the agreement up. So we look at a property. It's just a regular property, so everything applies. I need to get a mortgage. I need a home inspection. I would like to do another walkthrough before the closing, just to make sure it looks the same. I would like to make sure that I get a mortgage, and then the interest rate and the payment is under a certain amount so I can afford it. Okay. So, and then all of a sudden, let's just say I win the lottery. Okay. So we put in the offer, we get it accepted. Now I have 7-10 days to do my financing and inspection, and I win a lottery, and then I call you back and say, hey, listen, I don't need that mortgage clause in there anymore. You can just cross it out. So if we haven't submitted that offer, you could cross out that mortgage clause, and I could initial it. You still want to put it in there because you want to show that you allowed me to have it in there.
Okay.
And you did your job by protecting me by putting in the clause and then crossing it out. If you say, well, he had cash, so he didn't have to finance it. But then I could say to you, I didn't want to use my cash. I wanted a mortgage.
Yeah.
And guess what? The liability starts shifting back to you. Okay? So when you write up the agreement, you want to write everything in there like it normally would go. And then if you want to cross it out and initial it, that would keep you safe because it would show and it would demonstrate that you did your due diligence to protect me.
So you're saying that question is probably I was given the agreement, and then what could be a possible question that they could ask?
Well, a lot of times when they give you clauses, most of the questions are related to you making corrections. Yeah. They're actually looking for dates and mistakes in the agreement. So usually what they're looking for in an agreement is they're looking for your irrevocable date to the execution date to when you actually got the offer and when you got the offer back. That's really the most important part. And then they're looking for their components with clauses if they're in the right order. So let me just read. I'll just say a clause. I'm not even reading it right now, but we're just gonna use some common sense here. If you put a clause in for inspection, what is it gonna sound like? It's gonna say that this home or this offer is conditional upon a home inspection by a professional, not by my friend, who thinks he's a contractor. Not like that. So it's this offer is conditional upon a home inspection by a professional, and it should be conducted within 5 days. Any remedies required should be negotiated within 3 days, or this offer will become null and void. So I want to say a couple things. One, it's got to be conditional upon me getting a professional. Two, it's got a timeline in there. Three, it says something about when it's not going to be valid anymore, when it expires. Okay? So if I do an inspection and I find that the roof is leaking and it needs a $10,000 repair and I'm not willing to do it, the seller might say, okay, fine. Let me reduce the price by $10,000. You go ahead and still buy the property.
Okay.
So there could be an amendment at that point to correct that issue. So what you're looking for is understanding how a clause comes together. You want to understand that there's like 3 or 4 parts to every clause. It's conditional upon this reason, this thing, up to this thing, up to this time. Okay, so it usually breaks up into about 4 or 5 pieces, each clause. And so once you read the clauses and break them up into little parts, you'll be able to pick and choose a correction really easily, because then it won't make sense. A lot of times, if there's a clause that can auto waive itself, or it auto, like, if I don't get a mortgage in 7 days, this offer is null and void automatically, and you release back my deposit. We don't really write clauses like that anymore. We just write that if I don't get the mortgage within a certain number of days at a certain percentage or certain payment that I can handle. Because what if I get a mortgage and the payment's too high and I can't pay it? So you're just factoring in a lot of things that come into it. Mainly in the agreement, you're going to watch out for irrevocability. Do you know what that means?
Yeah, like the deadline or
the expiry date of the offer. So if I make an offer irrevocable on January the 10th, right, and I wrote it on January the 1st, it's alive for 10 days. Okay? So if you don't accept it and you don't counter it, it's no good. But if you counter it to me on January the 9th, and you counter it to me, so there's basically 1 day that it's still alive for. When I counter it back, I could change the irrevocable date and have you initial it when I send it back to you to keep it alive, or I could accept it. The main thing is, a lot of the main questions they ask you are related to, here's a guy, he put in an offer, here's the irrevocable date, here's when he got it, here's when he actually signed it back, here's when he picked up the phone and said, here's my verbal counter offer. And you can accept a verbal counter offer, but then you still have to sign it within the time period that's irrevocable. So if you did a verbal acceptance, that's nice and dandy, but in real estate, nothing's good until it's written. So until he actually signs it, he could back out and disappear and whatnot, because you can't hold him to anything. Okay? So most of the mistakes that they're looking for are usually date related, and then the clauses will have some certain mistakes in them.
Yeah, the clauses, I think I got a lot of the date ones right.
Mm-hmm.
It was the clauses that I had difficulty breaking down. I don't know why.
Yeah, this one says, well, this question says clause by clause review clause 3 notices, so it looks like those are the date ones, so that's related to dates. So you might have made a mistake on the dates on that one.
On notices?
Yeah. Or were you doing a waiver? Was your question with a waiver? Because when you have a condition up to a certain time period, you have to also waive it if it's successful. So if you got a mortgage in 7 days and you got a mortgage commitment, now the agent acting for that person would send a waiver saying, hey, we got the financing, we're good to go.
I got a question that it was a mortgage question, I don't understand, so when should there be a waiver condition and when shouldn't there be?
Well, you pretty much have to waive mortgage and inspection, pretty much, which is your 2 main conditions. Okay. Those are the 2 biggest conditions of your agreement, right? Okay. I mean, you could have other contingencies or other conditional items, like you have to sell your home before you buy this home, which is a huge condition, but that means you still have to get a new mortgage and you still have to do an inspection, most likely. And there could also be a condition, your mortgage condition could also contain the condition for appraisal. Appraisal is very big too. So if you sell a home for $300,000 and it gets appraised and it only appraises as $280,000, the $20,000 difference might have to come out of the buyer's pocket now, and he should have it ready if he wants to continue. Because once it appraises, that's it. It's not gonna. You can try to fight it, but usually there's no success in most cases.
So, but like more or less, basically, you just use a waiver when something's fulfilled. Like you waive.
Something you made conditional. So if you have to go out there and get a mortgage for 7 days and get a commitment, then you want to waive it as soon as you got it. How would they know you got it? You can't just email them and say, hey, I got the mortgage. You can send them a commitment, but you have to go by the agreements step by steps so that the legal agreement, if a lawyer or a judge looks at it, he's just going to look at it factually without knowing you, the buyer, or the seller. Okay, so it's got to be really crystal clear, step by step in writing type thing.
Okay.
So if you want to go over an agreement like we want to break it down, we can do one more session and actually break down an agreement with clauses in it.
Okay.
Okay.
Just a quick question. Okay. What are the differences between like a customer service agreement? Like
Big difference. Big difference.
That came up a lot, and it was like there was one question where it was like an agent was having an open house, and a client walked in, and she already had signed a customer service agreement.
Okay.
Is he allowed to talk to her still? Like, is he allowed to?
Yeah, let's do the scenario. Let's walk through that scenario. Let's do two different scenarios. You have one person who calls you on the phone and says they've never gone out with an agent. They want to buy a particular type of property. They want your help. They're going to work just with you, okay? And they're committed to you. That's a buyer agency right away, right? That's pretty simple. You understand that?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you imagine a customer service agreement, imagine a retail store.
Okay.
All right? You're standing in a retail store. You're selling a product behind you on the shelf. So somebody walks in and says, hey, Alex, I'll take that product on shelf number 2. You give them that product, and they're your customer. They pay, and they leave.
Okay.
That's a customer service agreement. So now, did you notice one thing with that scenario, that it was a very limited transaction? You didn't have to disclose as much. You didn't have to get deeply into a lot of things.
Yeah.
When you have a buyer agency, you better disclose every single thing you can know, imagine, and think of that could be a concern.
But why would someone sign a customer service agreement before?
Just as a choice. It's their choice. So, I mean, like, let's just say I like to shop online, but I don't want you calling me, though. And I don't want you emailing me, and don't ask me if I want any of your help. There's people like that out there.
Okay.
There's no advantage for them to actually not have full disclosure. A buyer agency, if they're actually trying to do a task of getting a property and having somebody really look out for their interest, a buyer agency will be a good tool for them to have, even though it puts them on the hook for commission. But I mean, like, let's say I'm going to use your time for 6 months to find a downtown, a condo investment or a duplex or a triplex or whatever. If I want you to really work hard and you want to be motivated, if I show I'm committed to you in that transaction, and if you find me a super good deal that saves me 50 grand, I'll pay your 10 grand commission. Okay? So it really depends on how you define the relationship and explain it to your clients so they understand what's going on. So some agents also have a preference. Let's say it's your listing. You're doing an open house. Somebody walks in. You don't want to really get into all the explanation why they're selling, where they're moving. You don't want to do that. So you just make them a customer because you say, you know what, I'm really, I'm working for this listing company. I'm working for this listing for my seller. And even though you have to act very fairly, you don't really want to get into, opening up a lot of information if you just don't want to. You could just make them a customer because it alleviates your liability too when they're just your customer in that case. Because remember, if you're doing a dual agency, now you have way more liability. So if the person's going to buy the property anyways and you don't have to get into all that other stuff, let them pick their own inspector, let them do all their own due diligence. You can just give them the right, information, whatever they need if they ask you, but you don't have to sit there and volunteer all day.
But when someone signs a BRA, they're stuck with you.
Right? Yeah, but the reason why they signed a BRA is because they really wanted to work with you.
No, exactly.
I mean, like if I pick a stockbroker or a car insurance company, you can think of any services in life that you really use, and you'll pick somebody because either you like them, trust them, or they're with a big company that just behaves wonderful. So, I mean, like if I call Rogers and they don't treat me good, I might go to Bell because they treat me great.
Right.
It's the same idea.
But, so with the customer service, they're not, so basically there's nothing set in stone, basically.
It's more like where they're deciding or you're deciding to let them purchase the property but you're not actually spending time to